Every year when Thanksgiving rolls around, you probably come across memes like this, claiming Thanksgiving is really a racist holiday built on genocide. The evil and racist Pilgrims came across the Atlantic, desecrated graves, stole food and land, and murdered thousands of American Indians. Then from the other side, we hear from people who want to defend Thanksgiving, but they often paint the Pilgrims and Puritans as angels who descended upon the continent and did nothing but charity work. The truth is more complicated than either of these extremes. The Puritans were far from perfect, but they were not monsters. Compared to Virginia colonists and the Spanish, the Puritans were much more humane and ethical, although far from perfect. The American Indians that inhabited the region were also neither innocent victims or monsters themselves. The relations between the two sides was much more complicated. To get to the truth, let's unwind this complicated history and try to be charitable to the American Indians and the Puritans. Let's begin at the beginning. The first colony in the region was of course Plymouth, founded in 1620. The Pilgrims landed here to escape religious persecution in England and to try to start a new life. The Pilgrims in their day were called separatists, and were a subset of the larger Puritan movement. The difference is the Pilgrims rejected the Church of England, and the Puritans sought to reform it from within, which helps explain why a group of Pilgrims were the first to land in New England. However, larger numbers of Puritans also immigrated in the following years, and established a colony north in Massachusetts Bay, which is where Boston now is. It didn't take long for the Massachusetts Bay colony to become the dominant colony in the region, but prior to this, Plymouth was the first and largest colony. When the Pilgrims first arrived at Cape Cod in November of 1620, they encountered very few American Indians. The native population had already been decimated by the plague of 1617 to 1618, which left vast amounts of land uninhabited. On top of this, most of the native population also distrusted Europeans at this point. Relations with Europeans prior to this had left both sides skeptical of each other. There were clashes and disputes between natives and traders. Some Indians were kidnapped by Europeans, like Squanto, who eventually was able to make it back to New England. And after one clash with French traders, the surviving 5 Frenchmen were enslaved by the Indians and treated harshly. The Pilgrims first explored the territory of the Nausets. They were depleted of food, so when they came across some underground corn barrels, they could not help themselves but take the supply, but vowing to one day repay the Nausets, which they did in less than a year. The Pilgrims did desecrate Indian graves when they arrived, possibly in attempts to understand the wealth of the region. Despite the fact that they wrote, it would be odious unto them to ransack their sepulchres. Nonetheless, there were instances of desecrating graves, and according to their own records, they made an effort to put everything back to the way it was, to try and undo the affront. There was one clash with the Nausets before contact could be established, where both sides exchanged arrows and musket fire. But the Pilgrims recorded neither side experienced any casualties. Shortly after, the Pilgrims moved on and established a colony in Plymouth Harbor. They chose a site that had previously been the site of an Indian village that was devastated by the earlier plague, and was now deserted. Squanto, who had been kidnapped and taken back to Europe, was the sole survivor. Again, the Pilgrims really didn't seize land from the Indians of the region. Most of the land had been deserted due to disease that had ravaged the region. By 1620, it is estimated there was only about 15,000 to 18,000 Indians in all of New England. Then the smallpox epidemic of 1633 to 34 also greatly reduced the native population. Later on, most of the Indians were more than happy to trade land for tools and other European luxuries because they had so much of it. Shortly after settling, the Pilgrims' numbers were reduced greatly during the first winter. It is estimated that only around 50 people survived in the Plymouth colony. Then in March of 1621, it was Somerset, sent from the Wampanoag tribe, that approached the Puritans, looking to trade and form an alliance with the Pilgrims against their enemy, the Narragansetts. Squanto appeared at the second meeting and became a translator between the Pilgrims and the chief Massasoit. Within a year, the Pilgrims had peaceful relations with most of the surrounding tribes and had a firm alliance with the Wampanoags. The Wampanoags became pretty grateful after one incident where the Pilgrims were swift in recovering Squanto and a few other Wampanoags that were kidnapped by Narragansetts and their allies. According to the records, this was even accomplished with little bloodshed. 1 year later is when the first Thanksgiving took place. 90 Wampanoags celebrated a harvest with the remaining 50 Pilgrims of Plymouth. Some say turkey was not on the menu, but this is not accurate. Edward Winslow wrote that they ate fowl, and William Bradford says that there was a great store of wild turkeys. Besides this, they served venison, fish, and of course, corn. The celebration did not become annual, but we do hear of another celebration 2 years later at Plymouth. It is true that other colonies had days of Thanksgiving, but the later American national holiday was based on romanticizing the harvest feast at Plymouth in 1621. Throughout the early years of the United States, days of Thanksgiving were proclaimed, but it wasn't until 1863 that Abraham Lincoln made it a national holiday, promoting unity and thankfulness. Many have romanticized the events in 1621 while ignoring the complexity of the situation. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoags had an alliance, but there were still trust issues. Squanto had tried to use his power as translator to overthrow Massasoit, which backfired. Massasoit demanded Squanto's life, but the Pilgrims defended him because Squanto had proven to be necessary as their translator. Bradford reluctantly was about to give in to the Wampanoag when a ship was spotted off the coast, and the emergency meant an end to the current negotiations. Massasoit never really pressed the matter over Squanto after this, and Squanto remained with the Pilgrims for his own safety. The ship turned out to be English, which led to another colony north of Plymouth. Now this colony proved to be a nuisance by stealing corn and committing other abuses against the Massachusetts tribe. So trust for the English settlers among the native tribes began to wane. The Pilgrims at Plymouth managed to regain the trust of the Wampanoag a few months later when Massasoit fell sick, and Edward Winslow managed to travel to his home and provide care and remedies that allowed Massasoit to recover. According to the records, Massasoit allegedly said, "Now I see the English are my friends and love me. And whilst I live, I will never forget this kindness they have showed me." Massasoit returned the favor by warning the Pilgrims of a plot to wipe out both English colonies, and he offered his aid. The northern Wessagusset colony had mostly dissolved at this point, and most English there sold their possessions for food or offered themselves as servants to the various tribes. Allegedly, local tribes still planned an attack on Plymouth, and so the Pilgrims, along with some of the Wampanoag men, responded with a preemptive attack against the lead conspirator and his men, Chief Wittawamet, which ended in the death of Wittawamet and several of his men. Wittawamet's head was taken back to Plymouth and impaled on their fort. Even still, John Robinson admonished the men for their hasty resort to violence. After which, there was no further engagements with the Massachusetts tribe. More and more Puritans swelled to the area, and by 1630, Massachusetts Bay overtook Plymouth as the largest colony. Most affairs with the American Indians were overseen by the officials of Boston after this, and not Plymouth. By 1637, the population of the Bay Colony was estimated to be around 8,000, and the total English population of New England could have been as high as 20,000. Whereas the native population was decimated by smallpox in 1633 to 34. It didn't take long for the English to outnumber the Indians of New England. No doubt the diseases that devastated the American Indian populations came from Europeans, but germ theory was a few centuries away. It's not like the Europeans knew the ramifications of their expansions and early explorations. From what we can gather, most of the Puritan expansion was peaceful at first. Historian Alden Vaughan says, "One of the most persistent myths concerning the relations between the Puritan settlers and the American Indians asserts that the colonist robbed the native of his land. Such a view is no longer held by those reasonably well acquainted with the history of early New England." As we noted, the plagues of 1616 and 1633 greatly reduced the native population. Often the natives had more land than they knew what to do with. Indians often approached the settlers, asking to trade land for knives, tools, and other luxuries, which were lacking among the native tribes. More interesting is that thousands of the surviving land deeds show that the Puritans who purchased the land still allowed the Indians to hunt, fish, and sometimes even plant corn on the sold land. The land no longer belonged to the Indians, so Puritans could use it for raising livestock and farming. But they still allowed the native Indians to hunt and fish, and sometimes even plant corn on the land they previously owned. The General Court of Connecticut in 1649 even confirmed the Indians' hunting and fishing rights on the land within its jurisdiction. For no Indians are deprived of that liberty in any of our towns, provided they do it not upon the Sabbath day. Roger Williams wrote, in Key into the Languages of America, that it was a sinful opinion amongst many that Christians have a right to heathen lands. Instead, it was taught the land had to be purchased, not stolen or taken by force. It is also unlikely the American Indians didn't understand the implications of selling land to the Puritans. Accounts from Roger Williams and Edward Winslow indicate the Indians understood the boundaries of what constituted as their territory, and Williams testified, "I have known them make bargain and sail amongst themselves for a small piece or quantity of ground." No instance has been documented among the New England tribes where they believed all land was communally owned by all people. They understood and practiced land ownership, which was divided among chiefs called sachems, and they were more than willing to sell unused land to Puritan settlers in exchange for tools and weapons. Such exchanges were also helpful to the Indians, who saw the Puritans as powerful allies against other tribes they were enemies with. Having Puritans who owned muskets move into their region provided additional safety for more hostile tribes. Some critics bring up the Pequot War of 1637, which is often painted as an act of genocide committed against the native population. This is not accurate, and the truth is more complex. This was not a war fought along racial lines. Tribes like the Mohegans marched along with the Puritans, and other tribes like the Narragansetts and Wampanoags supported the Bay Colony, not the Pequots. The Pequots, which means destroyer in Algonquian, were actually seen as invaders by many of the other tribes, as they were not originally from New England, but migrated to the region just before the Pilgrims arrived. By 1620, they controlled many other tribes and had a considerable amount of power in the region, so the other tribes opposed them and sided with the Puritans. What led up to the war is complex. The Puritans didn't decide one day they wanted to decimate the entire tribe. In fact, in 1634, the Puritans of the Bay Colony signed a treaty with the Pequots. However, the Puritans claimed the Pequots were not honoring the terms of the treaty, and additionally, they went back on their willingness to trade. After it appeared the Pequots harbored the Indians who murdered John Oldman, who went to Pequot territory to trade, war against them was declared. Men led by John Endicott went to Block Island, where they destroyed wigwams and cornfields. But the casualties were low due to the Indians retreating and hiding. They then went to Pequot territory on the mainland, where negotiations broke down and hostilities ensued. Some English were tortured and killed, and the Puritans of the Bay Colony and the Mohegans who sided with them responded with hostility as well. Not all of the Puritans agree with his expedition. Spokesmen of Plymouth, Connecticut, and Fort Saybrook all condemned the Endicott expedition, arguing the arrogance and the harshness of the expedition meant Pequot retaliation was inevitable. The worst travesty was the Mystic Fort Massacre. Due to increased hostilities and atrocities committed against some of their own men, Connecticut ultimately joined the war effort and launched an offensive, which ended with the massacre, where Pequot men, women, and children were surrounded by English, Mohegans, and Narragansetts as the fort burned. Anyone who tried to escape was shot, and there was a lot of friendly fire on the Puritan side. After the war ended, most of the remaining Pequots were placed under the control of various tribes. This was the biggest conflict with the native population prior to King Philip's War of 1675, with neither side really looking clean. Most notably was that it wasn't a war fought on racial lines, nor did it involve the Pilgrim community of Plymouth. The native tribes didn't think of themselves as one race, but as many different tribes and people groups. The Puritans didn't actually think of the Indians as a different race, and incorrectly thought they were white. They believe Indians descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and their dark skin was a result of the sun and harsh elements. Because of this peculiar belief, they were rarely racist towards Indian tribes during the 17th century, and they didn't look at themselves as racially superior. The main issue with the Puritans was not racism, but ethnocentrism, where they believed their mission was to eradicate the Indian cultures and convert the natives entirely to the Puritan way of living. This, of course, proved to be an impossible task and too demanding, which resulted in many tribes turning away from missionaries. The Mohegans and Massasoit were loyal to the Puritans, but also resistant to Christian missionaries. This didn't result with the Puritans becoming hostile towards their allies. Again, their goal was to integrate and convert the Indians, not conquer and enslave them. This is one reason the Puritans strove to treat the Indians of New England ethically and fairly, although they were not always successful. They encouraged Indian children to attend their schools, including universities. However, due to diseases, many Indians died the more they tried to integrate with Puritan society. John Eliot took up the task of translating the Bible into Algonquian. To do this, he first had to learn the language and develop a written form of it, because at the time, the native Indians had none. Records indicate the Puritans were very fair even in court cases involving disputes with Indians, and allowed them to sit on a jury at times. Due to language barriers, this was only reserved for disputes between different Indians. At times, the Puritan officials would execute English settlers for unjustly killing native Indians, as they didn't believe the English were racially superior. They punished Englishmen who stole and abused Indians, took Indian testimony very seriously, strove to extend equal treatment to all Indians, and had no laws against intermarriage, although there's no indication this ever happened. There are some records that indicate the Puritans sold some natives off into slavery in the West Indies, but this was not frequent and seems to have only been a punishment reserved for repeat offenders. In other words, it was a last-ditch solution for someone who kept repeating various crimes and refused to stop. The Puritans of the Bay Colony did exert their power over the native tribes in ways that were probably too overbearing. They tried to limit the amount of alcohol and guns the Indians could acquire. But some of the tribes, like the Mohegans, seemed to have preferred Puritan rule, as the Puritans were effective at solving disputes in more peaceful ways, and there was good reason to think they minimized warfare in New England. Their aim, although not successful, was to establish a model Christian society, so they worked tirelessly to do so, and because of this, often involved themselves in tribal disputes to prevent a war from breaking out. As we noted, one of their main character flaws was their ethnocentrism. They believed Puritan culture was superior, and the traditional Indian cultures of the region should cease, and all the local inhabitants should adopt the Puritan way of living. Such a demand proved to be too much for most of the Indians, and those that did convert and tried to integrate often died from disease. But the Puritans and the Pilgrims were not racist. They thought the natives were lost white Israelites, and did not see themselves as racially superior. In 1675, however, relations took a turn for the worse with King Philip's War. Metacom, of the Wampanoag, also known as King Philip, led a coalition of a few tribes to try and reclaim the power they had slowly lost in the region. What led up to the war was also complex, and the Puritans likely deserve a lot of blame for imposing too much control over Metacom. Among Metacom's grievances were that the English had used debt and trickery to purchase and take away too much of the Wampanoag's land. The English livestock were also ruining what little land they had left. A 1671 court ruling practically made him a subject of Plymouth. Christian missionaries had converted so many Wampanoags that his power as sachem had greatly diminished, and he was convinced the English poisoned his older brother after he became ill and died. War was probably inevitable after it appeared Metacom's men murdered the Harvard-educated Christian Indian, John Sassamon, for warning the Puritans about Metacom's plans for war. The 3 Wampanoag men who were accused of the murder were put on trial and executed, which was the last straw for Metacom, who claimed their innocence. But even this war was not divided on racial lines, as many tribes still sided with the Puritans, and some remained neutral. The Puritans initially began persecuting many Christian Wampanoags for fear they would side with Metacom, but eventually they realized they needed their Indian allies to defeat Metacom, and a little over a year after the war started, it was a Wampanoag Indian that took down Metacom with a musket shot. After this, the English colonists didn't treat the Indians with the same respect, and by the start of the American Revolution, the remaining Indians were a small minority in New England. What led to the diminishing of the Indians of New England is complicated, and disease was likely the biggest contributor. The native population didn't hand New England over to the Puritans, nor were they forcibly removed or victims of endless waves of genocide. There is no doubt that in other places, Europeans did commit genocide and enslave the native populations. The American government often inhumanely dealt with Indian populations and committed horrible atrocities. Even in New England after King Philip's War, the Indians were not treated well or respected by the English. But we often want to project this mentality back onto the Puritans and the Pilgrims of Plymouth. The Pilgrims were not the monsters some make them out to be, but they were also not the saints they saw themselves as. The first Thanksgiving is not a stain on American history. It represents a real harvest that happened in 1621, where imperfect people with different political and religious views were able to come together and share a meal and give thanks for what they have received. Similar to what happens today when you gather around your Thanksgiving table. There is no evidence Thanksgiving is based on racism. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite was true. More importantly, is that it represents a time when people of vastly different racial and cultural backgrounds set aside their differences and came together to share a meal. As the historical record shows, they did not always get along or agree, but that is what Thanksgiving is supposed to be about. Imperfect people setting aside their differences and coming together to give thanks and share a bountiful meal with each other. So don't worry about the claims that Thanksgiving is racist, and enjoy the holiday.